Hi, I'm Cindi McGee, and you're watching Polymer Clay TV. Today's project is inspired by this set of gorgeous floral tiles that I found on Overstock.com. I'm using Primo Sculpey Sea Green for my base, and I've conditioned and rolled it to a setting 4 on my Atlas machine. Next, I used some yellow ochre tint pan pastel to add a layer over the surface of the sea green clay. I used the clay blade to cut off a strip of the clay wide enough for the silk screen I'm going to be using and for the rectangular cutter that I'm going to be using. For the first set of tiles, I'm using my Cindy's Peacocks Borders silkscreen from CreateAlong.com, and I'm going to use these fan vine flowers. Place it colored side down onto the clay sheet. I like to give it a little roll just to make sure it's going to stay in place a little bit better. Using DecoArt's Americana Decor Multi-Surface Satin Almond to silkscreen this image. I like these multi-surface satin acrylics. They're a little bit thicker and they silkscreen really well. Set it aside to let the paint dry on the clay and wash the silkscreen right away. I'm going to use the rectangular cutter that I'm using for all of the pieces to cut out several rectangles from another piece of the base layer. The closest thing I had in my silkscreen stash for a lacy pattern was the Serbian silkscreen from CreateAlong, but you can substitute as you need to. And I'm just going to place it at an angle onto each of these little square rectangular tiles, like it is in the original tile. And I'm using some fine black pan pastel to screen the image onto each of these pieces. I like to place a little piece of plastic over my pan pastel screened images, same with mica powders, and just give them a press to make sure that it's set into the clay well. For the flowers, I'm going to use the small piece of leftover, and I'm going to add even more of that yellow ochre tint pastel to the surface. I'm using this mandala floral type silk screen, which was also from CreateAlong. I think it's sold out right now, but anything similar would work. And the same fine black pan pastel to silk screen onto this piece. Use a small floral cutter to cut out several of the flowers from this piece. It's okay if they're not full flowers because we're only going to use part of them on each tile anyway. This second tile has a tiny dot background in the area above the lace pattern. And to create that, or to mimic that, I'm using a really fine ball stylus tool and some black acrylic paint, and I'm just going to add the little dots to that open area on each of the tiles. Next, add those flowers to the right side base of each of the tiles, trimming off any that you don't need. All right, we're going to set those aside for a minute. Now the paint is dry on that first one. It's time to add a bit of coloration to each of the fan flowers. This is chromium oxide green tint pan pastel. I'm going to just add with my fingers a light layer of that over the surface where we've silk screened. And I'm going to come back with touches of phthalo green and black, and I'm using a little bit of each on my finger, and just adding a bit of color to the center of each of those flowers. Then I'm using the same rectangular cutter to cut out several of the tiles and just arranging it so the flowers are where I want them. Okay, now I'm coming back to that second set of tiles I made, and I'm going to use more of that pale green pan pastel and just add a little bit over the area where I added the dots to soften those dots a little bit and add more of that green shade back in. For the third set of tiles, I'm going to cut the remaining piece of clay in half and use half to decorate. Some small leaf-shaped cutters. If you don't have these, you could use a paintbrush or a paint pen and just draw them on, but I'm using my cutters and dipping them into some black paint and then very gently applying them to the surface to create an all-over pattern with the different leaves, just randomly. The flowers on this one are actually dot flowers, so I'm using a small ball stylus and the same black paint, and I'm just going to basically dot in and create those flowers. Then I'm going to let that paint dry. Now that the paint is dry, I'm going to use that same paler green pan pastel and just apply some over the surface to soften the black just a little bit and give it more of a muted effect like the original tile. Use the same rectangular cutter to cut out the tiles from this piece. For the next tile, I rolled some more of that clay out to the same setting 4 and used the yellow ochre pan pastel, and I'm silk screening with the same mandala floral silk screen that I used earlier and the same black ultrafine pan pastel. Use the same flower cutter to cut out several flowers from this. Place those flowers onto the second half of the piece that we had left from our original sheet. To add some of the background detail like it is in that original tile, I'm using a ball stylus and I'm dipping it into that phthalo green pan pastel just really gently, and then I'm going to make the dot flowers like are shown, similar to those shown in that first picture of the tile that I just shared. To use that same really fine ball stylus and the black paint to draw in some branches or vines, I guess, and add some leaves to mimic that original tile. And a few swirls here and there. I used the slightly larger ball stylus and the black paint to make a dot in the center of each of the flowers. I did do that on the original flowers on that earlier set of tiles too. And then used that fine point stylus to add some light lines or marks between the petals on each of the flowers. Next, I'm using that yellow ochre tint pan pastel again, and I'm going to just very gently add it over those background details to soften and mute them a bit. Then use the same rectangular cutter to cut the tiles from this sheet. At this point, I remembered I forgot the little dot detail on the background of that very first one we did where we silk screened the fan flowers. So I'm using just a plain ball stylus, a small one without any paint, to add some sort of textured dot detailing around the flowers on each of those tiles. Use that phthalo green and black, again just a little bit on my finger, and rubbed it around the edges of each of the tiles to highlight the edges, mimicking those original tiles. For my base sheet, I'm using more of the Sea Green Primo, which I've rolled to a setting 3 on my clay machine, and I'm going to begin arranging my tiles in an alternating pattern until I run out of tiles. This is the slab before I made my jewelry with it. It would also be great for polymer trading coins or to cover a box. Lots of different options. I used the largest tribal shell cutter from CreateAlong.com to cut 2 pendants, and then the smallest tribal shell cutter to cut a pair of earrings. I baked everything according to the manufacturer's instruction, and then I used some DecoArt DuraClear matte varnish to seal each of the pieces, and I used gunmetal metallic findings to assemble them. For more inspiration, join our Polymer Clay Tribe Facebook page. Over 18,000 members sharing projects every day. For lots more creative polymer clay ideas, visit the Polymer Clay TV blog.